I was trying to figure out what could possibly be my comparative advantage. And I couldn't find one except that perhaps just before lunch you might want to see some pictures. So here is a picture of Egypt. Egypt gets, in 2010, Egypt got 1.3 billion in military aid and 250 million in economic aid. Egypt is the country that gets the most aid from the US, except for Israel. Unemployment rate is above 25%, and as you can see from this picture, there is deep, deep frustration against a regime that is both corrupt and extremely tired, both physically and institutionally. If we had given all this aid that went to Egypt to Africa, we could have given $20 per year per child for every child under 5 who lives in Africa today. So for some people, like Jeffrey Sachs, this is a sign that we could have ended poverty if we had had the political will to do so. With this $20 per child per year, you could have bought bed nets to protect her from malaria, deworming medicine to make her stronger and make her go to school more, all of the immunization that she would need, and you would have plenty of cash left over. So if we don't do that, it's because we don't want it, because our priorities are wrong. On the other side, we have Bill Easterly, who is actually a graduate from MIT, who says that no, in fact, this is a symptom, this is a sign, the Egypt case and many other is a sign that aid in general fails, and that it's useless, or maybe worse than useless, because it contributes to prop up regimes which should have gone long ago. So the issue is, how do we say who is right? And it is very difficult to say who is right. If you look at the aid to Africa, it's been increasing steadily. Those are the blue bars here on the picture. And of course, growth has not really been stellar. That's the red, that's the GDP per capita is the red line. So some, like Bill Easterly, would conclude, well, it means that aid has dramatically failed. Because we have no idea what would have happened without the aid. Maybe it would have gone downwards, like here, or maybe it would have gone upwards, for that matter. And this is like the problem is what Jerry Hausman said. We only have one world. We only have one Africa. And we just don't have a counterfactual to know what could possibly have happened in this case. So when people don't use this kind of figure, they use anecdotes. So Rwanda is a very popular one on both sides of the aisle. Rwanda got tremendous amount of aid after the genocide, and it did very well. And now the president, Paul Kagame, wants to win the country of aid, and has started to do so. So Rwanda is claimed as a success, both by Jeffrey Sachs and by Dambisa Moyo, by Jeffrey Sachs as a success of aid, and by Dambisa Moyo as a poster child for self-reliance. Of course, what is very hard to arbitrate between this he said, she said, that we have no idea what would have happened in Rwanda if the policies had been different. So what has happened in development economics over the last few decades is to try and move away from those big questions, can aid make a difference, to much smaller questions, much more focused questions to which we might possibly have an answer. So it's a little bit, in a sense, the empirical equivalent of what Avinash Dixit said is a MIT-style theory. This is, in my view, MIT-style empirical work, though not only MIT, obviously. So one of these questions, for example, is malaria. Malaria is a focused question. I would agree it's not a small question. It's pretty serious. It kills about 900,000 people every year, give and take a few. 91% of them in Africa, 85% of them under 5. In fact, that's the leading cause of under 5 mortality. So how do we go about it? Well, there's one thing we do know from various experiments done by doctors is bed nets are an effective way to prevent the spread of malaria. Long-lasting insecticide bed nets are relatively cheap. For about $10, you can manufacture one, ship it to Africa, and teach a family to use it. the problem is that $10 is still too much for many African families when the GDP per capita of a country like Kenya is about $300, for example. So only about 10 to 20% of children at risk sleep under a net. And of course, as the conventional public finance would tell us, we should subsidize bed nets because malaria is highly contagious. So if I sleep under a net, that helps the kid next to me. And in fact, the externalities are not linear because the estimates are that when 50% of people sleep under a net, the mosquitoes don't have time to transmit the parasite before they die, and therefore there is no transmission anymore. So you can achieve herd immunity from 50%. I would give you a very strong argument for subsidizing net purchase. In fact, we might even want, there's no reason to stop at zero. It's not like inflation, which for some reason is capped at zero. We could go and, interest rates, sorry, which for some reason is capped at zero. We could go and pay people to use nets, and maybe that's what we should be doing. So this is a policy that has been argued, for example, by the WHO or by Jeff Sachs. But then there is always a new economics to come forward. And there is this very old principle in economics called sunk cost fallacy, which is what you paid for something shouldn't influence what you do with it, because once you've paid for it, you've paid for it. And these arguments coming from psychology and economics saying that maybe the sunk cost fallacy isn't a fallacy to the extent that people actually are influenced by it. So there could be what people call a psychological sunk cost effect, which is unless you pay for something, you consider it's worthless. So the argument is that if you give bed nets away, people are not going to use them as bed net, but as wedding veils or fishing nets, like on this picture. So the argument is very heated. It's a very, very ideological argument with very strong position. Of course, there are dollars involved, but not very many dollars when we compare to the US economy or anything, but a lot of passion and ideology. And sitting from where I sit, this is a bit strange that this debate is dominated by ideology, because it seems we could pretty much resolve it. It seems that what we do need to know whether bed nets should be distributed for free, or we should pay people to use them, or we should make people pay a little bit, or make people pay full fare, is number one, what's the price elasticity of the demand for bed nets? Do we lose a lot of people if we start charging for them? Second, so that's the standard sort of economics 101 question, the empirical equivalent of that. Second is, if people get bed net for free, will they use them or will they waste them? So that's the more sort of behavioral sunk cost fallacy hypothesis. And second, which is something that also comes forward, is that are people going to be used to handouts? So you give them the bed net for free, and maybe they use the bed nets, but you can never, ever sell them a bed net again, or chlorine, or school meals, or they will always expect handouts. And all of these questions, in principle, you could answer by looking at what people do, with the caveat that you have the Jewish mother or Asian mother problem, which is whoever decides to pay for a bed net is probably not comparable than someone who will only get a bed net if they get it for free. So a big movement in development economics in the last, say, 10 to 15 years has been to try to create a situation where people are exposed to different conditions or treatments, but are in fact comparable. And the way you do this is the equivalent of the randomized controlled trials that are used in medicine to test the effectiveness of drugs. So to give you an example here, this is an experiment that was carried out by Pascaline Dupin, who is an assistant professor at UCLA and a former student of mine. What she did is to randomly select households all over the place and offer them nets, either for free, or with partial subsidies, or with full subsidies. And she randomly broadcast her vouchers for the various prices for the nets, so that people are strictly comparable. And when we look at their behavior, we know that it's the effect of the price they had to pay, as opposed to any differential selection. And what do we find? Well, the first finding is that the elasticity of demand for bed net is extremely strong. So for free, almost everybody get it. As soon as you make people pay just a little bit, the demand drops. And when you get to $3, which is only about less than half of the full price, the demand is basically all gone. So the price elasticity is very high. So if you start getting people to pay, you will lose a lot of people. Second question is, are they going to use it if you make them available for free? And there you find, in some sense, no evidence for this psychological sunk cost effect. People who paid for the bad net and people who had to, who got it for free are about as likely to use it. I should say it means both there is no psychological sunk cost effect and that the selection of people who decide to purchase the net is not affected by the price they have to pay. And the third question is whether getting a free bad net discourages future purchases. And you find, in fact, if anything, the opposite, which is people who got their first bad net for free are somewhat more likely to buy a second one when it's offered to them about a month later at an average price. So it seems people do not get used to handouts, they get used to nets, which is why, in the end, there is this learning and information effect going on. So what do we get from this? Well, number one, I think we answer a policy question of key interest. When that paper of Pascaline came about, that sparked a lot of debate, and that did change policies. For example, a big social marketing organization, PSI, changed their policy and started to give bad nets away. The government of Kenya is also now, this experiment was done in Kenya, government of Kenya is distributing bad nets for free in the maternal health clinic. Number two, and that's perhaps where it becomes more interesting from sitting in an economics department, is this gives you a window on how and why the poor make the decisions they are making. And here the big puzzle is, given that people are willing to use the net, seem to be valuing them, why is it that they are so price elastic, at least at the first purchase? And that's not an isolated thing for bad nets. The same thing is true for immunization. Immunization is the cheapest way to save lives. It's very, very cheap to immunize a kid. The Gavi Alliance and the Gates Foundation are pouring millions and millions of dollars on the problem. And yet, in a country, there is about 20 million children every year who don't get the vaccination they should get. And in a place like Rajasthan, India, where this picture was taken, 5% of children get the full set of immunization they should get. This is like a tremendous waste. It's hard to imagine a worse problem. And what's going on here? Well, we did an experiment to try to figure out whether small demand-side incentive would make a difference in the decision to get immunized. And what we find, this is a baseline, so almost never, no one gets immunized. After a year, there is some increase in immunization in the control group where we did nothing. Then we introduced some camps to make immunization easier, some increase to 17%. But then when you start giving this small demand-side incentive, we're talking about a kilo of lentils, the full immunization rate jumps from 17 to 38%. So it's a little bit the same thing where you get this very, very high price elasticity for preventive care, which contrasts with huge demand for curative care. And in fact, in experiments that I'm going to spare you the detail of, very low price elasticity for curative care. So people are willing to pay just about any price to cure their kid from malaria once they have malaria, but they won't get a bad net. So that is that's a mystery. So what could be going on? Well, part of it could be misinformation and mistrust. That's not only developing countries, in this country as well. There are ways where people decide that getting immunized is not so necessary anymore. Part of it could be procrastination, the natural human tendency to wait to do something. With preventive care, the cost you have to pay, like going to the center or paying for your bed net, is today, but the benefit is in the future. So you might as well wait a little bit to do it. And that's why offsetting the small cost with a small benefit, like for example in the case of the immunization program, is so effective. Or maybe it's a combination of the two things. regardless of what it is, understanding exactly what's going on is key to design effective healthcare policy in developing countries. For example, what are the lessons that come out of it for me? One is absenteeism. This is a closed health center in Udaipur district. 63% of centers are closed when they should be open. Absenteeism is very pervasive and is amazingly costly because it introduces both mistrust and increases those little costs that stand in the way of people doing the right thing. Secondly, information is important, but we have to recognize that information is going to be difficult because learning about preventive care is very, very hard for people who had no high school biology and even for people who had high school biology. So there is a lot of trust, and having the right message and way of diffusing the information is hard. Thirdly, we cannot possibly overemphasize the importance of making things easy. And this is something that, from the comfort of our lives, we don't fully realize. For example, we don't realize that water comes chlorinated in our tap free of charge when we moan about the fact that the poor don't boil their water. Well, we never had to boil their water. We don't realize that we have to immunize our children because otherwise we can't send them to school. So that is like a very powerful incentive. And then we meaning the policymakers, experts, etc., make big speeches about the importance of the poor really understanding what they need to do, and we shouldn't bribe them to do the right thing. We are constantly bribed and helped to do the right thing in our lives. So why did I spend so much time on that question of healthcare? Just because it's, I think, a good illustration of the modus operandi in development economics today. Take a pretty focused question and bring it all your attention and your focus and try to answer it very well. The question, of course, is whether when we do that, we sort of give up on the large questions of how our economy is going to grow and are we going to get rid of poverty one day, whether we have completely exploded the problems into a myriad of small problems and we're too far from the big answer. So obviously, if I thought the answer was yes, maybe I would not have phrased the question that way. I do think this very patient step-by-step approach is a very productive way of trying to understand how the poor behave, why they behave the way they do, and therefore how we can possibly help them get out of poverty traps or get growth going. And it's not going to be easy because this is from the accumulation of these experiments and experiences that a set of general principles can maybe start to appear. But this something that it needs a lot of replication, something that works somewhere may not work elsewhere. It also means that in a lot of cases you have to be like Keynes and change your mind when the facts change, because the facts easily change on you. But I don't think there is another way, really. And in a sense, I think there is an analogy between this way of proceeding and 20th and 21st century medicine, where you have a back and forth between trying to understand what a particular molecule do and then going to big projects like the Human Genome Project, where the two kind of feed off each other to develop medicines. And there are no miracle cure to anything in medicine. There are just thousands and thousands of drugs and a better and better understanding of the human body, and together that amounts for millions of lives saved. So I also wouldn't like you to be fooled by the apparent modesty of the objective. Deworming sounds a sort of very, very small thing. It takes a pill twice a year. How can that be possibly important? It turns out that deworming, kids who have been dewormed for one more year than comparable kids when they were in school earn 20% more every year when they're adult. 20% more every year is a lot of years of good growth in Kenya. This study was done in Kenya, and there has not been that many good years of good growth in Kenya anyway. So these actually things that can quantitatively be extremely important here and now, and have policy implication A few years ago, I was in Davos, started this Deworm the World organization, which is kind of get all of these rich people to give money to deworming, which is sort of pleasant anyway, and get this, so making some progress in deworming as many kids as possible. So where are we? Well, in a sense, I think there is a pretty clear moral case for trying to help here and now if we can. I think there is an efficiency case as well. It seems like a considerable waste not to do the maximum we can to help kids like these kids get educated and healthy. My personal view is that it can't possibly be bad for growth in that when and where the growth spark starts, people who are properly educated and healthy will be probably more likely to take advantage of it. Even if it were wrong, I don't really see a strong case not to do the maximum we can. And in a sense, I don't think we have a choice. I think that's a political imperative as well. And go back to Egypt, I think the poor are not going to sit silently while we are trying to figure out how we can make their economy grow or their labor market work better. And I'll finish with Roosevelt. I replaced the word country, which he was using in 1932. The world needs, and unless I mistake its temper, the world demands bold, persistent experimentation. It is common sense to take a method and try it. If it fails, admit it frankly and try another. But above all, try something. The millions who are in want will not stand by silently forever, while the things to satisfy their needs are within easy reach. Thank you.